The sky over Berlin had always been safe, or so they believed. On that cold morning, the air above the city carried a familiar rhythm. Anti-aircraft crews scanned the horizon out of habit more than fear. Radar stations plotted dots that behaved as expected. German pilots returning from escort missions relaxed their grips on the controls as the grey sprawl of the capital appeared beneath them. Berlin meant home, fuel, ground crews, certainty. The war might rage at the edges of the Reich, but here, over the seat of power, the sky was supposed to obey rules that had held since the first bombs fell. Enemy bombers came, yes, but only so far. Their escorts always turned back. Always. It was a law of distance, of fuel, of physics itself. Then someone noticed the glint. It was small at first, almost nothing, a faint sparkle far above the haze. A young flak observer narrowed his eyes and adjusted his binoculars, expecting to confer a trick of light or a straggling bomber catching the sun at the wrong angle. Instead, the shape resolved into something sharper, cleaner. A single-engine fighter, then another, then dozens. They were higher than German fighters usually cruised, and they were moving with a confidence that felt wrong, not racing, not fleeing, circling. Reports filtered upward slowly at first, cautious and hedged, unidentified aircraft, high altitude, unusual formation. The tone carried confusion more than alarm. No one wanted to be the officer who claimed enemy fighters were calmly flying over Berlin. Such a statement sounded foolish on its face. Fighters couldn't do that. Not Allied fighters, not yet. The bombers, yes, but their escorts had to peel away hundreds of miles earlier, forced to choose between saving fuel or saving bombers. Everyone knew this. It was taught, it was proven. It was safe. Radar screens began to fill with shapes that didn't turn back. In control rooms, operators exchanged glances. Calculations were redone. Bearings checked. Altitude recalibrated. The dots held steady, weaving gently but persistently like sharks that had found shallow water. Phones rang. Orders were given, then questioned, then repeated louder. Scramble calls went out to nearby airfields, their urgency climbing with each minute. Pilots ran to their aircraft with an unease they couldn't quite name. The engines roared to life, as they always did, but the familiar vibrations failed to bring comfort. Something about this morning felt different, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. As German fighters climbed toward the reported altitude, disbelief hardened into dread. The silhouettes were unmistakable now. Long noses, broad wings, drop tanks slung beneath the fuselage like a promise kept. American fighters over Berlin. The radios erupted. Confirm identification. They're not turning back. How are they still here? This is impossible. Pilots strained forward in their cockpits, eyes darting between the sky ahead and the fuel gauges that defined their own limits. They had flown against American fighters before, but always at the edge of the Reich, always knowing that time was on their side. Stall them, harass them, force them to burn fuel. Eventually they would retreat. These pilots had built their tactics around that certainty. Now the certainty was gone. The Americans didn't dive or scatter when spotted. They didn't break formation in panic or rush to disengage. They simply adjusted their spacing, rolled lazily onto new headings, and waited. That waiting was the most unsettling thing of all. It suggested planning. It suggested excess fuel. It suggested that this moment had been anticipated and rehearsed far away, long before any German pilot lifted off that morning. As the first dogfights ignited, the sky fractured into motion. Tracer fire stitched the air. Engines screamed under sudden strain. But even in the chaos, a pattern emerged. The Americans chose their moments carefully, diving only when the odds favored them, climbing back to altitude with disciplined patience. German pilots, trained to defend a shrinking perimeter, found themselves pulled upward and outward, burning fuel faster than instinct advised. Every maneuver carried a cost now, and the meter was running. Below, Berlin continued its routine, unaware of how profoundly the rules had shifted. Trams rattled along streets. Smoke rose from factories. Civilians glanced up at the distant contrails with mild curiosity, not yet grasping their significance. They had lived with bombers overhead before. This seemed no different, but for those in the air, the difference was everything. The capital was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target wrapped in habit and hope. Messages raced through command channels, stripped of their earlier hesitation. Enemy fighters present over Berlin, sustained presence, heavy numbers. Commanders stared at maps that suddenly felt too small. Distances that once offered comfort now mocked them. 1,100 miles had shrunk to nothing, erased by engineering planning, and a quiet confidence that radiated from those circling silhouettes. One German ace, veteran of countless engagements, found himself lining up behind an American fighter and hesitating not out of fear but confusion. He had expected desperation, a hurried escape. Instead, the enemy pilot rolled smoothly into a defensive turn, perfectly timed, conserving energy, daring him to follow. For the first time in the war, the ace realized he was the one being managed, guided into choices he didn't want to make. Fuel warnings began to blink. German pilots glanced down, then back up, calculating whether they could press one more attack. One more climb, one more burst of fire. The Americans seemed immune to this pressure, their drop tanks granting them a margin that felt almost cruel. Each minute they stayed reinforced a message that needed no words. The sky over Germany belonged to no one anymore. As losses mounted and engagements broke off, the Americans remained. They escorted bombers all the way in, all the way out, and then lingered still, as if to ensure the lesson landed. The psychological weight of that lingering pressed harder than any bomb. It wasn't just that they had arrived, it was that they could stay. By the time German fighters disengaged and limped back to their airfields, the truth had settled like frost. The capital had been exposed, the war had crossed an invisible line, and there was no uncrossing it. In the quiet that followed, long after the American fighters finally turned west, Berlin's sky felt unfamiliar, as if it had learned a new loyalty. And somewhere in that vast, cold airspace, a belief that had held for years finally broke, silently, completely, and forever. The moment the first shots were fired, the air above Berlin stopped being abstract and became brutally personal. Tracer runs ripped past canopies, white and red streaks carving brief, violent signatures into the sky. Engines howled as throttles were slammed forward, superchargers whining as pilots clawed for altitude or dove for speed. What had begun as disbelief hardened into survival instinct. The capital below shrank into a grey blur as dogfights unfolded at heights where mistakes were fatal and seconds felt stretched thin. German pilots attacked with urgency born of habit. They had always been the defenders here, the last wall. Diving passes came fast and aggressive, cannons barking, shells tearing through empty air where bombers should have been. But these weren't T-bombers. The American fighters broke cleanly, rolling out of danger with a smoothness that felt rehearsed to the point of arrogance. They did T-scatter when pressed. They flowed. One pair covered another, climbing as their wingmen dove, turning every German attack into a puzzle with too many moving parts. The radio chatter grew frantic. Calls for assistance overlapped with shouted warnings. High above you. Break left. They were climbing back. How are they climbing? Back! Voices strained against oxygen masks. thick with disbelief and strain. German pilots had trained to fight enemies who needed to leave. These enemies had no such urgency. They fought like men who knew exactly how long they could stay and chose to stay anywhere. Altitude became the battlefield within the battlefield. The Americans held it with stubborn patience, refusing to be dragged down unless it suited them. Every climb by a German fighter was met with resistance, a calculated response that bled energy and fuel. The thin air punished impatience. Wings shuddered at the edge of stalls. Engines coughed when pushed too hard. Pilots felt the weight of physics pressing against their confidence. Below them, the bombers came through in disciplined streams, silver formations stretching toward the horizon. In earlier raids, this was where German fighters thrived, tearing into exposed bombers once their escorts peeled away. Today, the escorts stayed. They wove above and around the formations like shepherds, daring any attacker to commit. When one did, the response was swift and merciless. A diving American fighter would appear seemingly from nowhere, guns flashing, forcing a break that ruined the attack run, and often sent the German aircraft spiraling away, trailing smoke. Losses began to accumulate quietly at first, then all at once. A wingman didn't answer a call. A familiar voice cut off mid-sentence. Parachutes blossomed far below, tiny white flowers against the dark earth. Each absence was felt sharply. These were not green pilots being lost. These were men with years of experience, instructors, squadron leaders, the kind of losses that couldn't be replaced with rushed training and speeches. Fuel gauges crept downward with merciless honesty. German pilots found themselves glancing at them more often than at the enemy. Every hard climb, every full-throttle burst burned precious minutes off their endurance. They had launched expecting a familiar fight, quick engagements, a retreat, a return home. Instead, the fight stretched on, minute after minute. The Americans refusing to disengage. The capital lay beneath them, but it offered no refuge in the air. Orders came down to prioritize survival, to break off if fuel dropped too low. These orders were obeyed reluctantly, bitterly. Turning away felt like surrender, yet staying meant risking forced landings or worse. Some pilots pushed too far, chasing an enemy just a little longer, only to find themselves gliding back on fumes, praying their airfields were still within reach. A few never made it. The Americans noticed this hesitation and exploited it with cold efficiency. They pressed attacks just enough to force German fighters into energy-draining maneuvers, then broke away, climbing back to safety. It was a cruel rhythm, one that turned defense into desperation. The longer the fight went on, the more uneven it became, not in numbers but in confidence. On the ground, command centers struggled to keep pace with the reality unfolding overhead. Reports contradicted assumption. Requests for reinforcements collided with shortages. Airfields scrambled everything they had, but distance worked against them now. Fighters launched from farther bases arrived late, climbing into a scar already shaped by American presence. They entered fights at a disadvantage, learning the new rules the hard way. For German pilots still in the air, a subtle shift took place. The enemy stopped feeling like an intruder and began to feel like a fixture. The Americans were simply there, part of the environment, like clouds or wind, dangerous, unpredictable, ever-present. That realization gnawed at morale more effectively than any propaganda leaflet ever could. As the bombers completed their runs and turned west, the expected moment came and passed. The escorts did not peel away. They stayed with the bombers, guarding them mile after mile, then lingered even after the last formation cleared the city. Some German pilots, low on fuel and options, could only watch from a distance, powerless to intervene. The humiliation stung deeper than loss. Eventually, one by one, German fighters disengaged. Some did so under fire, some slipping away unnoticed, some diving for home with warning lights flashing. Landings were tense, engines sputtering, pilots silent. Ground crews sensed it immediately, the way cockpits opened slowly, the way helmets were removed without ceremony. Faces were pale, eyes distant. Questions were asked, then abandoned. Up above, the Americans finally began to turn back, their mission complete. They formed up calmly, as if leaving a familiar patrol area rather than the heart of enemy territory. They had done what they came to do, and more. They had proven endurance, reach, inevitability. When the sky finally cleared, it felt wrong, too open, too quiet. German pilots who had landed found themselves staring upward, half expecting the silver shapes to reappear. The battle was over, but its echo lingered in every calculation, every briefing, every uneasy silence. Something fundamental had shifted, and everyone who had flown that day knew it. The war in the air would never feel the same again. When the last American fighters finally turned west, there was no sense of victory in the German airfields, only an unsettling quiet that pressed down harder than the roar engines ever had. The sky above Berlin looked the same as it always had, pale, indifferent, endless. Yet everyone who had fought in it that day knew it had changed forever. The silence wasn't peace, it was aftermath. Pilots climbed out of cockpits stiffly, some helped down by ground crews who sensed, without being told, that something was wrong. Helmets were set aside. Oxygen masks dangled loose. Mechanics asked questions and received only nods or brief, clipped answers. No one bragged, no one argued. There were fewer aircraft returning than had taken off, and the gaps were impossible to ignore. Empty dispersal spots stared back like accusation. In briefing rooms, maps were rolled out again, but they no longer offered reassurance. The red pins marking enemy range suddenly seemed meaningless. Lines that once represented safety fuel limits, escort boundaries, turn-back points had been crossed and erased in a single day. Officers spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't betray their own unease. They talked about tactics, formations, future adjustment. What they didn't say hung heavily in the air. Berlin was no longer beyond reach. For the pilots who had fought, sleep came poorly that night. When it came at all, it was fractured by memories of silver shapes glinting in the sun, of engines that wouldn't quit, of enemies who didn't behave the way enemies were supposed to. Some replayed the fights again and again, searching for a mistake they could correct next time. Others lay awake staring at ceilings, realizing with a slow, sinking certainty that next time would be worse. Across the city, civilians sensed the shift without fully understanding it. Word spread quickly enemy fighters had been seen over Berlin, not just bombers but fighters. The idea unsettled people more than any raid. Siren. Bombers came to destroy and leave. Fighters suggested something else entirely: control, presence, dominance. Conversations in factories and apartments lowered in volume. Jokes fell flat. The war felt closer now, more intimate, as if it had stepped inside the walls rather than pounding at them from afar. In distant Allied airfields, American pilots landed with their own kind of silence. Their aircraft rolled to a stop streaked with grime, paint scorched near gun ports, drop tanks empty or jettisoned. Ground crews rushed forward, clapping shoulders, counting holes, tallying returns. The pilots removed their helmets and breathed deeply, the smell of fuel and oil mixing with cold air. They didn't celebrate wildly. They didn't need to. They had seen the disbelief in the eyes of their enemies, felt the shift in the air themselves. The briefings were calm, precise, almost clinical. Altitudes, headings, engagements, fuel consumption, everything noted, everything measured. But beneath the professionalism ran a quiet satisfaction. They had gone farther than anyone thought possible and fought on equal terms at the very center of enemy power. They had stayed. That mattered more than any individual victory. The change seeped into places no report could measure. In flight schools, instructors paused longer before answering questions about range and safety, choosing words carefully so they would not pass their own doubts to young men barely old enough to shave. In factories, workers looked up at the sky when engines passed overhead, no longer assuming they belonged to one side or the other. Even officers who spoke confidently in public found themselves studying weather forecasts with unease, knowing that clear skies now favored the enemy as much as themselves. For the pilots who survived the war, memory fixed that day with painful clarity, not because it was the bloodiest or the loudest, but because it was the day certainty died. One former fighter pilot would later say that before Berlin, he believed the sky had edges, invisible walls that defined where danger ended. Afterward, he understood there were no walls at all, only whoever had the strength to cross the distance. The Americans kept coming, and with each return the shock dulled but the damage deepened. What had once inspired fear now inspired resignation. Crews prepared for missions, knowing the odds would worsen, knowing the enemy would be waiting above and beyond places once considered unreachable. The sky became a place of attrition, not glory. And somewhere between the roar of engines and the quiet after landing, the meaning of air power was rewritten. It was no longer about defending cities or striking targets. It was about presence, about showing up where you were never supposed to be, and staying long enough for everyone to notice. Long after the last shots were fired and the last aircraft grounded, that lesson endured. Maps would be redrawn, borders shifted, histories debated. But the sky over Berlin would always remember the day distance failed and the moment that war revealed its final truth. That belief, once broken, is the hardest thing to rebuild. Back in Germany, weeks passed, but the memory of that day did not fade. Every scramble afterward carried a new tension. Every sighting report was taken more seriously. Pilots found themselves scanning the horizon longer, expecting American fighters to appear where logic once said they could not. Training changed. Tactics shifted. But adaptation could not undo the truth that had been revealed. The advantage of distance was gone. Losses mounted in the months that followed, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. Experienced pilots fell, and their replacements arrived with fewer hours, thinner confidence. The Americans returned again and again. Their reach normalized, their presence routine. What had been shocking became expected, and in that expectation lay defeat of a different kind. The sky no longer belonged to those who lived beneath it. For some German pilots, the realization came slowly. For others, it struck all at once during a quiet patrol when the radio crackled with a calm American voice, close and unmistakable. In those moments, the enormity of the change settled in. This was no longer a contest of daring raids and desperate defenses. It was a war of endurance, and endurance now favored the other side. Years later, survivors would struggle to explain exactly when they knew the air war was lost. Some would point to statistics, to production numbers, to fuel shortages. Others would talk about morale, but a few would remember a single day. A single sight, American fighter circling calmly over Berlin, as if distance itself had surrendered. That day marked the moment the sky stopped being a shield and became a battlefield without borders. It marked the moment belief cracked, belief in limits, in safety, in the old rules that once made sense of chaos. From then on, Every clear morning carried a question, every contrail a warning, because once the impossible appears and proves it can stay, it doesn't just change the war, it changes what people believe is possible.